Welcome to Lok Sabha Television. You're watching Climate Matters. I'm Suman Sahai. Our guest today is Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, renowned scientist, institution builder, and now Member of Parliament. Welcome, Dr. Swaminathan. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
We will discuss today, I thought, the broad scope of climate change and its impact on human security. I mean, we've all spent a lot of time looking at climate change in its little boxes, the impact on water, the impact on energy, etc. But there is a colossal dimension to climate change. And in fact, many governments and international organizations have begun to say that perhaps the threat from climate change is greater than the threat from international terrorism. And that is a very big comparison. What is your take? What do you say to this?
Well, I will generally agree. Climate change is probably the greatest threat to human security we have ever faced. It's a mega catastrophe because it affects every aspect: food security, water security, health security. There will be new problems of health, all vector-borne diseases, malaria and so on will become much more important. So it affects all parts of a human life and human security. And therefore, and it's a man-made calamity which we will not have imposed upon ourselves. Therefore, it compounds the problem of a danger which we could have avoided, but we are unwilling to avoid.
And we already have such disparities. You know what strikes me when we discuss this question of climate change and its impact? Of course, the impacts are going to be on developing countries and on the poorer in developing countries. And yet we are unable to achieve any kind of consensus. I mean, Copenhagen was a disaster. Cancun does not promise very much. It's as though this world was divided when it's not. You know, when the ice caps melt and the sea levels rise, when land turns into desert. I remember when there was a crisis in Vietnam, the boat people came. And the boat people came to the shores of every prosperous country. I often wonder whether there is this kind of inability suddenly to see that this world is integrated, and when the crisis goes beyond a point, that the developed countries are severely under threat.
Increasingly, we all know it's the poor nations and the poor in all nations, whether it is United States, anywhere, because they have the least coping capacity. The people who have the least coping capacity are most affected, and they are the poor everywhere, all over the world, but the poor nations will suffer more. And we know climate change affects the tropical and subtropical areas much more than the temperate part of the world. And therefore, it's unfortunate that there is no global consensus. Everyone is looking after their own particular interests and not our humankind's interest, although we all say they're the only planet we have and it's the only planet we should safeguard and so on.
Right.
But that planetary citizen's role is not getting reflected in any policy, common agreed policy relating to human security. It's all a top dressing. I will give you some money, so I will continue to emit.
And even that money is all readjusted money.
All these new kinds of clean development mechanisms and carbon trading and so on are methods of the rich countries avoiding their own responsibility by transferring a little money and so on. This is unfortunate because there is nothing like a global common commitment, a global common minimum program to contain the factors which are responsible for climate change.
Do you think that it's because they can get away with it, or because developing countries have not been forceful enough in really projecting the disaster in the dimensions that is standing? I mean, yes, people are writing reports, they understand statistics. But
well, everybody, there is a growing awareness today because thanks to the media, Copenhagen, for example, was a concentrated source of education all over the world, because whenever similarly Cancun will generate a lot of material, lot of studies, lot of reports and so on. But all that awareness should lead to action, and that is not happening, you see, because normally awareness, analysis, action should be a continuous chain. But that is not happening because the action is being again transferred to the poorer people and to the poorer countries. And I would say even nations, developing nations also, we put corresponding burden. Who will suffer more? Those who have no water, those who have what we call ecological footprint is so low. They have no footprint at all.
Absolutely.
Because they're not making any demand on natural resources.
And yet you burden them further.
You burden them.
But, I mean, looking at the scale of what we as a country already suffer in terms of discrimination and in terms of, say, all of the climate change indices, whether it's water or natural resources, we see the water situation emerging as a crisis in this country already. I mean, the Kaveri Tamil Nadu thing, Karnataka thing. We already face an extremely worrisome and critical situation of internal insurgency. And much of that is being attributed to the fruits of development, such as they are, being unfairly divided. Now, with this additional burden, do you see a serious threat getting even worse?
Last straw in the camel's back, as we say.
Oh my God.
It is increasingly the burden is being transferred to the poor, and the responsibility for mucking up is with the rich nations, and rich in all nations, I would say. But nevertheless, we look upon the poor, because the poor are the majority of the world in our own country, even by modest, what we call the more severe, most austere method of calculation of poverty. It's still 40-45% of 120 crores are considered to be below the poverty line, and ours is the most austerely defined poverty line. So what are we now? One is to restate the problem. The other is how to reverse the situation and how to go forward is the challenge today. And it is clear that international conferences, high-profile conferences with a lot of photo opportunity and so on, are not leading to results. We have seen the last, even whatever progress was achieved in Kyoto has been reversed because they don't want any more
binding agreements,
binding emission cuts and so on. A very clever attempt has been made in Copenhagen to reverse the Kyoto commitments. And I don't know what, as you rightly say, what will happen in Cancun.
Right. But do you really see this connection between the growing unrest in our own country? I mean, there's an international dimension, but are we doing enough? Are we as a country doing really enough, given the threat that we already face of this whole thing exploding in our faces?
There are two kinds of problems which are coming up. One is severe natural calamities. The frequency is increasing, there's no doubt. In our own country now we are facing in Ladakh an unprecedented damage. It's a cold desert. Normally one doesn't expect this kind of cloudburst, rainfall, and snow melt and so on. Pakistan is experiencing, again, a very difficult. Our own country, parts of the country like Bihar, Jharkhand, and parts of West Bengal are experiencing, again, drought this year. They had a drought last few years, and again a drought. And Soviet Union had an unprecedented drought. They have banned the export of wheat and so on. With the result, international price of wheat has gone up.
Right.
So there are mega events taking place, probably with greater frequency than before. We can't attribute it entirely, everything to climate change. But nevertheless, mega calamities, the frequency is increasing. And we are not able to predict the weather. Our meteorological people today, with same kind of confidence, they had some years ago and so on. So we have entered a new phase and disaster management. And as you rightly said, the impact is much more on the poor all over. And in India, rural India is more affected because they depend entirely on agriculture, mostly on agriculture for their livelihood. And agriculture, water security, food security will be the first calamities. We know there is a lot of evidence that 1 degree centigrade, Copenhagen Accord was to limit to 2 degrees centigrade, but there is nowhere in sight. Almost all calculation emissions have not decreased. They are increasing in some cases. Therefore, 1 degree, 2 degrees means wheat production, 1 degree centigrade, 6 million tons less wheat and so on. So the farmers will suffer because most of the farms, even in the Punjab today, are 2 hectares. The smaller the farm, you require more is the need for marketable surplus. If you don't have marketable surplus, you don't have cash income. But then if you're going to further reduce your problem, and the aquifer has gone down, the water table has gone down because people are exploiting the aquifer. So there are a large number of serious issues. But all these, in my view, being any anthropogenically or human-induced disasters, can be only reversed by human beings. You can't depend on God to help you. God helps only those who help themselves. Therefore, we should take action. And there is a so-called Prime Minister's 8 missions and so on, which are there, which read well in paper. But how are we going to translate those missions into activities at the local level?
I'm glad you mentioned the National Action Plan on Climate Change, because if you see the NAPCC and its 8 missions, and you see the international concern with this whole question of human security, do you get the sense, as I do, that the NAPCC falls way too short of understanding the real dimension of the problem? And this whole global concern that is being expressed, and I think rightly so, that it's not just one or the other factor, but that human security per se is threatened.
This is true. National Action Plan in many respects does not address some of the serious issues. For example, more than 25% of our population live within 50 kilometers of the shoreline.
Right.
About 30 crores of people live along the shoreline. And today it is clear sea level rise going to take place. Countries like Maldives, even Bangladesh, are all the time preparing for what may happen if there is sea level. Maybe a slow process, but nevertheless it is clear it's going to happen.
Well, Bombay is not that safe
even
either.
if we reduce the commission, the damage we already caused will be slowly increasing. Areas like Diamond Harbour near Calcutta in our country, the level of rise is even higher than normal. Now, how are we going to prepare ourselves for that kind of situation? How are we going to insulate the coastal communities, both from loss of life and livelihoods? We had a tsunami in 2004, January 26th. I call it December 26th, January 2004. Just next day, the Boxing Day, next day after Christmas.
Right.
And that was a wake-up call. What will happen? For the first time, people saw if the sea goes up and comes down, what are the consequences?
Yeah.
Loss of life, loss of property, loss of livelihoods for fisher communities and so on. So I don't see in our country the kind of urgency which is needed. We are hoping for the best, that something will happen. But even those who hope for the best should prepare for the worst. And that alternative action plan, whether it is agriculture, whether it is water security, whether it is livelihood security or health security, the kind of preparedness we should have, anticipatory action, anticipatory research, is not at all coming. And one of the missions in the Prime Minister's national program is on sustainable agriculture. And that is one where we see no action at all.
That is, I think, even the 8 missions that there are, how many people, you need a huge national effort to roll these programs. But do you think that there is sufficient preparedness even with the limited 8 missions that we have?
I would say very inadequate. I won't say sufficient at all. There are on paper and pronouncements. Paper and pronouncements
but not
contain,
much more than that.
But it does not reflect the action plan. For
the
example,
urgency.
We are refusing to take advantage of our own strength. One of the great strengths of this country is our parliamentary democracy, which goes up to the grassroots level.
Right.
There are in panchayats now 1.2 million women members, and 1/3 are women, and now it's going to become 50%.
Dr. Swaminathan, we'll need to take a break just now, and we'll come back after the break. We'll break for a short while, and we will continue this discussion with Dr. Swaminathan. So don't go away. We'll be back in a bit.
Elected people, representatives, the Gram Sabhas, both participatory democracy and representative democracy. Representative as represented by election, and participatory by the Gram Sabhas, the whole community is involved.
Welcome back. You're watching Climate Matters, and we are talking to Dr. M.S. Swaminathan. So you were saying that our greatest advantage, before we took the break, you said our greatest advantage is in fact our parliamentary democracy, which allows you to reach to really the last citizen. And we don't seem to be doing that.
We are unwilling to take advantage. We have this wonderful democratic structure. Elected people, representatives, the Gram Sabhas, both participatory democracy and representative democracy. Representative as represented by election, and participatory by the Gram Sabhas, the whole community is involved. What kind of preparation? They don't even know what the climate change is about and what the 8 missions and so on. Nobody has heard any of those missions anywhere in any village you ask, they don't know. And tribal and other communities are even more. Those who are most vulnerable have the least knowledge of what is happening, because there is no effect at all on education of the public, There's some effort by the radio and the television and so on, but doesn't reach out.
Or not
For
enough
example,
effort.
we have been suggesting that every panchayat and every nagarpalika, they should have at least one elected woman, one elected male member trained as climate risk managers in the science and art of the management. What happens if there's drought? What happens if there's flood? What happens if there's a tsunami? Whatever it is.
Right.
What happens if the temperature is high? You have a problem. Now all these we can anticipate, and like with the computer simulation models, if this happens, then you do. How do you checkmate a particular problem? This kind of capacity building at a grassroots level is not there.
Right.
Some people sitting up, going to Cancun or Copenhagen,
Yes.
they cannot save the country.
No.
The people who can save are these elected members of the panchayats, if they are enabled to do so. We are not empowering them, we are not taking advantage of this unique strength of our democracy, namely starting from below.
Right. To come to another aspect of coping with climate change, I mean, there is such a huge unfairness in this whole situation, for better or for worse, but it's almost like the polluter is getting paid. All they have polluted, they have created climate change, and we, if you were to say a they and we thing, we are the sufferers. But even all the solutions that are being proposed under the CDM, under the Clean Development Mechanism, the carbon credit thing, it's all working as an anti-poor thrust ultimately. If you say this large-scale afforestation, large-scale afforestation is very good, but it displaces a lot of people. This whole thing about saving water and this damming of waterways and rivers, yes, you will save water, but you also displace a lot of people. So you're creating actually by the solutions that you have, or for example, even the nuclear energy which is now being said. So is there another way of doing it?
No, somehow simple solutions don't appeal to us unless they are involved thousands of crores. They are not solutions at all. For example, you have been showing in Jharkhand and Uttarakhand simple things like local level gene bank, local level grain bank. They can make a lot of difference. Local grains, underutilized crops, or orphan crops as we say them. They can be maintained by the local people in the local grain bank. Then we won't give all the grains to the rats and so on. We'll not lose them. There are steps which can be taken at starting from below. I would build from below local level grain banks, local level gene bank, local level water harvesting, water banks. They can share the water and so on, and try to develop alternative cropping strategies. For example, Bihar, I am sure from past experience, there will be rain. It won't be completely dry. It may come a rain, but it will become a torrential rain. There will be floods. From drought, you will go to a stage of floods. Even if there is an opportunity for you to sow a new crop, the seeds are not there of the right variety and so on. Jharkhand is the same. For many, rice is rice, but rice is not rice.
Correct.
If you have lost under 50 days of cultivation, then you have to change your variety, a new kind of variety. That kind of thing can be done at the local level by the local solutions, and also local crops which are much more climate resilient crops. For example, many of the millets and ragi, even jowar, bajra. When we started the high yielding varieties program in 1966, 5 crops were included as major crops for food security: wheat, rice, jowar, bajra, and maize. Maize is getting more and more important with poultry consumption going up. But gradually it has come only to 2 crops, wheat and rice.
Right.
Although the Prices Commission announces prices, minimum support prices for nearly 25 crops, it is only in these 2 being implemented by the government. With the result, the other crops have no market, and people give up cultivation. And the genetic erosion is very fast. And I think at a time when we need more genetic variability, more genes for a warming planet as we call it, we are losing precious variability in major crop plants, largely because we have not provided a market for them, the whole series of tubers, whole series of pulses and so on. So unless again we go back Gandhiji's concept of Gram Swaraj, or go into the grassroots level and build your policies from bottom up rather than in some cases nuclear energy you mentioned. Nuclear energy is supposed to be benign energy, although there are problems of nuclear waste disposal which are very important. Today even the drought and the fires in the Soviet Union, they're afraid of, not Soviet Union, they're present Russia, they are very afraid of nuclear power plants because the fires are going very near them as a result and so on. So there are risks, there are dangers which are there. hydroelectric power is also, but I would say things like biogas plant, the biomass utilization. In every village, particularly in the Barani or dry farming areas, rainfed areas, if we promote, because they have got animals, livestock and livelihoods are very intimately related in our country. And the ownership of the livestock is much more egalitarian than of land.
Right.
To look at. Therefore, that's why in the desert areas like Rajasthan, Barmer, Jaisalmer, you don't get farmer suicides because they have some multiple source of income. Some from sheep and wool, some from the local horticultural bear or some other horticultural plant and so on. The more diversified your source of income, the greater is your security for livelihood. So we should promote steps which are a revival of some of the older habits. Most of the areas, the tribal areas, they are practicing more risk minimizing agronomy,
right.
not profit maximizing agronomy.
Right.
The risks, they are more concerned because they have to eat something and therefore the food has to be safeguarded. There are a lot of lessons in our country which can be enlarged, extrapolated to a larger audience, but this will require a real reorientation in the thinking of the strategy for management of climate change. On the one hand, think of the large projects, nuclear power plant will take a long time to get 20, 30, 40,000 megawatts of power. It is a good power, and but will depend entirely upon foreign sources for the feedstock, the raw material and so on. Enriched uranium is to be obtained. But we have other sources, the biomass, the biogas, the wind, the solar. Fortunately, we are blessed with sunlight. Fortunately, one of the missions of the Prime Minister's National Plan of Action is a solar mission. If that is really given a push, more on a decentralized way, not only large grids, but solar power for lighting. We have seen in Koraput, those tribal areas,
right.
a solar lamp is considered to be almost a god. They worship it because they have no other light. They have no other light. This provides lamp. So the tendency to look at low cost, local solutions is gradually disappearing. And you know what, unless we reverse the paradigm, impart a pro-poor, pro-woman, pro-nature orientation, you will find it very difficult to solve it by these mega projects.
I think that's a very important message that everybody who's listening to this program should take home, that instead of these flashy and big mega things, look at the problems that we can solve or look at the solutions that we already have, because they're much more inclusive. They include people in that and respect their wisdom. But continuing this discussion on climate change, and because you've been so closely involved with the Millennium Development Goals and have been so responsible for pushing them forward on the global platform, if you look at the way things are going, I mean, climate change appears to become one more factor, apart from government inertness, that threatens practically all the MDGs, starting with hunger to development to education to gender. Everything that can go wrong with the already poorly retarded MDG goals.
To compound our problems. We already have many problems,
right.
but they get further compounded. We can anticipate and checkmate many of them, but they will require, as you rightly said, people power solution, people's mobilization of collaboration, and unless that is done, I've always said many of these problems require first education, awareness of why climate change and so on.
Right. Secondly,
social mobilization through our elected bodies. And finally, regulation wherever is necessary. In some case, for example, management of the aquifer. Anybody, you cannot, if you go to Israel, we go on talking about Israel. Israel, groundwater is a social resource. No, it is not a private resource.
Right.
Now today, if I have got enough money, if I own this building, I can tap as much water as I can from below. That cannot be in another country. So some kind of regulation by public consensus, not by just dictation and enforcement. So social mobilization, education, and appropriate regulation. If all these three, there could be synergy among them, then many difficult problems. Because if there is a problem, there is a solution. You know, if there's a calamity, there's an opportunity. If you look at the solution first, then things will go in the right perspective.
But you sound very hopeful that when there is a problem, there is also a solution, and that's a really good thing to tell ourselves, because this picture looks extremely gloomy. But you know, I want to ask you something that comes back to our own preparedness. You see at the international level this enormous engagement with the question of the threat to human security. not just in their own governments, in their own countries, but globally. And that's why I think even Kofi Annan has been involved in understanding how completely terrifying this is. Governments have been making strategic plans to deal with human security in their own countries and internationally if you have really something like the boat people happening at their shores. In this country, we have forums, we have platforms. There is a Prime Minister's panel on climate change. There's a parliamentary forum on global warming. What is your honest assessment of what these panels and forums are doing?
Well, they discuss important issues, but after discussion, there should be appropriate action. There's a big gap, growing gap, between discussion, analysis by very sophisticated brains and that transference to the field in terms of action. This is not only in the case of climate change. It is true today in agriculture, why our yields are stagnating, while our factor productivity is going. We blame extension is not effective. The growing gap between scientific know-how and field level know-how. Many of these problems are common across the board, whether it's climate change and so on. We must now, our whole thinking has to be reoriented. Thinking must become people-centric, pro-poor orientation, and not just lip service that we must do something for the poor. Because in every parameter, we are losing ground. The UN Millennium Development Goals, number one, very number one, reduction in poverty and hunger, we are not achieving the goal. So we should ask ourselves honestly, what is wrong with us? Why is it, in spite of all of our talent, in spite of enormous institutional strength, in spite of enormous scientific capability in the country, and enormous enthusiastic young people who are very willing to do, why are we lagging behind? We could go on comparing ourselves with China. China has wonderful grain storages and so on. But China developed all these last 15, 20 years. We were far more advanced before, in the 60s. But we have lagged behind because I think we are trying to live in an artificial make-up-believe world that we have got a high growth rate, we have come a world power and so on. But unless we go back to the realities, the human realities of our country.
Right. We will close this program now. But Dr. Swaminathan, I take home two messages from this discussion with you. One is this huge optimism that it is possible to find a solution. Just look differently and the solutions are there, you should find it. And the fact, the acknowledgement, and starting with that acknowledgement, the fact there is need for change, that we have structures but we lack substance and that we can really do much more on substance. Thank you very much for being with us today on Climate Matters.
Thank you, Suman. Nice talking to you.
We will close this now. We've had the great pleasure of having Dr. Swaminathan with us. Send us your responses. Do you have questions? Do you have comments? Do you have ideas? At climatematters@gmail.com. Thank you for watching Climate Matters.